The Woodward speaker for this year is Professor Fabrizio Zilibotti, who's visiting us from Yale, actually from Stanford, where he's staying these days, but he's the Tuntex Professor of International and Development Economics at Yale. Before I say anything, I should say that the Woodward Lectures are named after Mr. Eugene Sidney Woodward, who was a journalist, and through his generosity, UBC has established a lectureship to perpetuate his spirit of concern for economic freedom and his interest in fresh approaches to contemporary economic problems and institutions. So I think the talk today is fairly fitting to the mandate of the Woodward endowment. So, while let me say a few words about Fabrizio. You may already be a bit familiar with his work and who he is. A little background. So, as the name suggests, Fabrizio is Italian. He was born in Vignola near Modena, not far from where Matilde was born, actually, I suppose. He's also been a professor in many places. So, he's been a professor at Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, at UCL in London, where we briefly overlapped, actually, when I was a grad student, in Stockholm, at University of Stockholm, at University of Zurich. He's also had a string of visiting positions at Bocconi University, Tsinghua University in China, where he visits regularly because of his work on the Chinese economy. Also at University of Oslo, Bologna, Southampton, Prague, and as I said, Stanford. So Fabrizio has established himself in the field of economics with contribution in different areas. He's also been editor of many journals. He's co-editor right now of Econometrica. He's past managing editor of the Aristat. He's has had editorial position in various other journals. He's a past winner of the Irio Jansson Award, which is effectively the equivalent of the Clark Bates Medal in Europe. So it's awarded to a young European-based economist. He is a past president of the European Economic Association, a fellow of the Econometric Society, co-director of the Income and Distribution and Macroeconomics at the MDR, research fellow at the CPR, and the list goes on and on. I will not tell you everything, but you get the picture. So Fabrizio's interests cover a large cross-section of modern economic research. So he has had contributions in microeconomics, theory of economic growth, more recently on the new economics of conflict, field where we have many excellent researchers here now at UBC. And today he will talk about his work on the families and the family investment in kids and inequality. Actually, reading Fabrizio's CV, I just say this, it turns out that in 2009 he won something called the Golden Cherry Award that apparently has been also bestowed upon Enzo Ferrari, who was the founder of the Ferrari car company, and on the opera singer Luciano Pavarotti. So it's, the only thing he hasn't won yet is the MVP award and the Stanley Cup. So today's Woodward Lecture will be about the economics of parenting style, as you can see on the board. And in a recent book with Matthias Dobke at Northwestern, Fabrizio and Matthias examine the way inequality shapes parental investments and the behaviors towards kids, and how these behaviors feed back into inequality itself. The book has received much attention, and many newspapers have covered it. The Atlantic summarized the book with the following title: "Why Swedes are chiller parents than Americans." And there are much more grim versions of grimmer views of the book. The Washington Post wrote, "This research suggests that to reduce the epidemic of hyper-competitive and over-involved parenting in the United States, simply exhorting people to be more laid back will not work. The only solution is to attack the problem at the root by combating inequality." So we have the privilege to hear this firsthand from Fabrizio, so join me in welcoming Fabrizio.
So thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. It's a great honor, for the great hospitality and for the excessive introduction that I received from Giovanni. I hope it doesn't create expectation that I will sing something not good at that, not as good as Pavarotti at least. Instead, I will talk about the economics of parenting style, which is a topic that may sound a little exotic. Why would economists have something useful or interesting to say, or just anything to say about parenting style? In fact, this is a subject that has been in the realm of other social science disciplines so far, child development psychology, sociology. Well, the angle from which we attack this is, the interest that motivated us in studying this, is that this is a crucial aspect in the process of formation of human capital. And human capital is important for the process of economic growth, for the welfare of people, for distributional aspect. So the link between how a society develops and how parents behave and how this affects the future accumulation of human capital is the angle from which we look at this problem. But before I even start, let me acknowledge my depth with perhaps with many co-authors, but in particular with Matthias Döpke. So what I'm going to talk today will build in a certain way on three scientific contributions, all of them at Matthias, Giuseppe Sorrenti in two of them, and more recently also Francesco Agostinelli at UPenn. And already Giovanni has mentioned the book that we've published this year. This is a broader project that look at several dimensions of the economics of parenting, and hopefully it will or it is attracting an interest beyond just the academic community. So in this lecture, I will go through 4 points. First, I will outline an economic theory of parenting style and its role in the process of human capital accumulation. I will in particular point out the crucial role of economic inequality for parenting choices and the mechanism of feedback also, how this affects the process of accumulation of human capital, but also social mobility. I will discuss some empirical evidence and also some work in progress, and I will say something briefly about policy implication. So, as I mentioned at the outset, we are not the first, and not even the first discipline to look into the issue of how parents behave. In fact, a lot of the language we use is motivated from the child development psychology, in particular the work of Diana Bowman in the late 1960s, that created some categories in which you can distinguish between different types of parenting behavior. She said, some parents behave in more permissive, some in more authoritative, some in the more authoritarian. I guess permissive and authoritarian are almost self-explanatory, but let me at the outset say that we don't attach any value judgment. Sometimes in this literature there is the sense that permissive is not so good, authoritarian is not so good, authoritative is good. And we're trying to turn this into something, perhaps twisting even the original contribution by Bowman and others. We're trying to think about, more liberal parents who think children should discover the world at their own speed. And then, let me try almost to revert the typical, normative association. Authoritative parents. You can think of them as those who dialogue a lot with the children. If you are less optimistic, you can think of them as those who try hard to brainwash the children in order to make them think the way parents think children should do, even against their own instincts. And the authoritarian parents are those who put borders directly on behavior, that constrain behavior. We are not going to say much about, a number of very important issues that has to do with social problem, dysfunctional families. So none of our parents here would be, at least we will not say much about neglecting parents. Neglecting parents would be parents who don't, for a variety of reasons, do not put a lot of attention towards their children. All our parents will, in fact, do it. So there is a body of empirical literature that is discussed in more detail in the book, that comes from the child development psychology and also from sociology, that studies the effect of parenting style on children's outcome. So this would be only a small part of what we are interested in. In some way, this is not a book that tries to tell parents, behave in a certain way, your kids will do better, but more trying to understand how parents behave and why we observe so large variation over time and across countries. So, the book is not a parenting guide in this sense. What we do, and what I think is new relative to other disciplines, is that we put choice at the heart of our approach. So we construct an economic theory of parenting style where parents actually decide to behave in a certain way in order to pursue some objectives. Now, I don't want this to sound like we think people are ultra rational in all respects. A lot of the behavior that comes somehow automatically, it gets ingrained, imitating other parents, behaving by social norms. But somehow we think that ultimately there is some rationality. And I'm trying to convince you that that rationality is actually something we see in the data. In our way of thinking, parents can try, to affect their children through different strategies. Okay, so there is an economic literature that look at how much effort parents put in the upbringing of children. We try to go one step forward in thinking about how parents interact with their children. And so we think about two key strategies. One is persuasion, one is coercion. Persuasion, is trying to affect their children's behavior, but then not forcing children, but making sure that when they have to make some choice, they do it in a way parents approve of. Coercion is restricting the choice set. Oh, incidentally, let me go one step back. These colors have some meaning. It should help you see the slides. So permissive elements, liberal parenting is associated with blue. I had it the reversal because I'm European, but then after moving to the United States, that's the right way of putting the color, I guess. So that authoritarian parenting are red, and then I want something in between, and you have this purple. My wife thought it was a terrible color, but I thought it was good to keep something in between. Okay, so I'm going to emphasize how parenting styles is affected by the economic environment, and I'm going to try to convince you that this has some predictive power in explaining the real world. Before I start with my own contribution, let me mention also the depth that we have to other work that has been done in designing the economic literature. So recently there has been a surge of interest in the process of skill formation, and in particular in what happens at the early stage of that process. So the work by Nobel laureate James Heckman, Cunha, and many others, Karmit Segal among them, has emphasized how very important it is what happens in a very early childhood, and how this becomes a stepping stone of various forms in which children behave into adulthood. This work emphasizes the importance of what they call non-cognitive skills, and also showed by a variety of ways that these non-cognitive skills are malleable. So there is a view among some social scientists that everything is driven by gene. I would say that the work of these people proves that it's not all driven by gene. In fact, a significant portion, both of the cognitive, ability to solve problems, to think math, etc., but especially of non-cognitive skills, can be modified by behavior. One example of this is some type of, they study some type of interventions on disadvantaged families, and in a randomized way, they show that this has an effect, and a fairly persistent, or to some extent permanent effect, on the ability of children to think about future to focus on tasks. So these are characteristics that in our way of thinking as economists are partly captured by preferences. So we talk about preference characteristic, preference trait, and partly we can think about skills. So patience, for instance, is typically modeled as a trait of preferences, and you know, the ability of thinking about your own future is something that has been shown to be very much affected by some type of policy intervention. It cannot be that that this is genetic only, because otherwise there would be no such effect. Family environment has been shown to be crucial more generally for the process of preference transmission, and there are also some more recent paper that studied, you know, in connection with our work, the effect of parenting styles, and argue that there is some effect. We have also some evidence in the book, but I want to mention these papers. So then there is a stream of theoretical literature that think about, you know, models of preference transmission. So some papers emphasize the notion of imperfect empathy. So, you know, to some extent, parents may believe in some things. For instance, you know, we adapt to some religion and would like their children to do the same. And so there is a process by which imperfectly they transmit this to their children. There are papers that emphasize role models. You know, you have to transmit information, and you can only do it by showing that something is feasible. And then there is the line of research to which I think we are more directly part, which is what is called the Beckerian altruism. This is related to another Nobel laureate, Gary Becker, who emphasize how parents actually can, you know, first of all, they are altruistic, so they care about the well-being of their children, but also they can do something to enhance their skills. In some of this work, there is also a notion that actually people can modify their own preferences by some activities or the preferences of their children. So we are in this line of argument, although somehow we take also some of the insights of the imperfect empathy approach. The idea that you can restrict choice set is also, it's a bit new. As economists, we are traditionally think that the larger is the set of options you have, the better, but we know that there may be a reason why actually restricting choice set may be good. You know, you go to restaurants, you have a lot of unhealthy but attractive food, you prefer not to go to that restaurant. That's the notion. And with children, I think this is sometimes important. You don't want to expose children to the temptation to do things that parents don't like. Okay, so that's a general introduction. Let me talk about our theory. I'll try to sketch with the aid of a few simple equations, but keep somehow the flow more focused on concepts than on math. So think of life having 4 stages. Actually, 2 plus 2. 2 stages are childhood, 2 stages is adulthood. And think of a parent that maximizes its well-being. This is one parent, one child. We don't have a family with more adults or more children. So it's, in that sense, it's a drastic simplification. So there is a parent with a certain set of skills, the vector S, and that parent cares, first of all, about her own welfare, which is represented by a utility function that has as argument consumption and leisure intended in, you can think of a vector of things. There are many things inside there, but you classify into these 2 broad categories. But the way they appreciate these things, consuming things and enjoying, free time, theater, and whatever, is conditional on a set of preferences that is captured by a vector denoted by A. And so they live for 2 periods, so they have they derive some utility from that. In addition, they care about their children. So this Z is a weight that parent attaches to the child's welfare. The way in which they care about their children is the focal point of the theory. So they care about their children through 2 different components. One is blue and one is red. What are these 2 components? Well, one is the child's actual lifetime utility. So we can think of this as, parents looking at what children think it's good and fun, and just putting that as their part of their own enjoyment. You're happy to see the child happy of how life is going, that happiness of the child may to some extent have something to do with thinking about the future. So the child herself is savoring future, and the parents is then taking into account that through that utility function. But then there is another component, which is the way the parents look into the child well-being that is possibly different from the way the child herself regards the source of happiness. And the way in which you capture this is by thinking that, well, if you look at the continuation utility, so if you look at the blue V, well, that's the point of view of the child. So the child itself will care about the utility that is associated with being a happy child. There are two stages, so there's a childhood today, there's late childhood tomorrow, and then there is something that has to do with adulthood. So you can think that the child also imagines something about the future, but the child looks at this with her own preferences. So A1 and A2 here are the preferences of the child. And then there is a paternalistic self of the parent that looks upon the child perspective, but through the eyes of the parent. And so here you see the difference between the lowercase a and the capital A. This is the point of view of the parent. And what could be the source of disagreement? So why is this different from that? Well, because parents might have a different standpoint about what is important for life. For instance, risk-taking. Many children or young people like some type of risk that parents don't want them to take. So parents are somehow compromising in our model between a view of childhood which is the one of the child and their own. Some of them may be more paternalistic, so they put a lot of weight here. Some of them may be less paternalistic, and they put a lot of weight on the blue part. Okay? So the implication here is that there's disagreement. There are things that children do that parents don't like. And parents can do something at that. Well, one thing they can do is to just forbid that. We're not going to buy a motorcycle because that's dangerous. That's what my parents told me at some point. They could say, well, it's very good to work hard on your homework because that's going to be good for you. Also, it's fun to learn. I'm going to read you a bunch of stories that motivate you into learning things. And these are the type of things that affect the preferences of the child. So let me make an example. So this is difference in patience. Think about the weight of today enjoying something that happens today versus the weight of something that happens in future. This is a perspective of the child. So the child cares about consumption and leisure today, tomorrow, and this is what happens in adult life. So there is a recursive structure. So beta square is a weight on the future. It's a weight to the future relative to the present. The present here has this term A1 and A2. Let's say that these are larger than 1. And let's say that the parent has A1 and A2 equal to 1. What does it mean here? Well, it means that from the parent's point of view, it's good to see a happy child, but it's more important that the child does something that matters for her own future. That already leads to some disagreement. For instance, if there is to do homework or play with children, with other children, parents may have more of a bias into pushing the child to work hard. That's the way in which we formalize our idea here. Okay, so there is this tension between altruistic self and paternalistic self of parents. Okay, so now with this in mind, parents make choices, children make choices. Parents make choice about their own life, so they choose their consumption, they choose their leisure, they may accumulate wealth and do all these things. They control directly the consumption of the child, something we assume. So the consumption, parents have to take care of their children in the economic sense, they do it, but they cannot control what the child does in other dimensions. So there is something, or at least part of the leisure choice of the child is not under direct control of the parents. it's perfectly controlled by the parents. It may actually be different in different situations. For instance, the children are working at home in a farm, that may be easy to control what they do at every moment of time. But if a child is in school somewhere else, in college, that may be hard. Okay, so the parent is going to choose child rearing investment vector, and we are thinking that there are two components to it. One of these is accumulation of formal skills, of cognitive skills, and the other is accumulation of non-cognitive skills. Now, parents make choices subject to two constraints. One is money. So money can be spent for the sake of the consumption of the parent. Money can be spent in fun activity, going to theater. Money can also be spent in enrolling the child in a bunch of extracurricular activity, in sending the child to private school or not, in living in a neighborhood or in another neighborhood. So all these choices have to do with money, but there are also important choices that have to do with time. So the two constraints that we emphasize are time and money. So parents may have to compromise with this, and sometimes they may not be able to do things they might otherwise like to do. Now comes the child. Child is going to make a choice, and this is the investment aspect. So when we think about the leisure choice, think about playing with friends, or to the opposite, spend time doing the homework. And they're going to do that in order to maximize their own utility, and they're going to be subject to a bunch of constraints. One of them is the choice set that has been imposed by the parent. So the parent may be able, and different in different environments, to constrain what the child can actually do. And that's one of the dimensions in which parents intervene. And finally, we have a set of law of motion that determines the accumulation of skills. So this has been called by Heckman and Cunha the technology of skill formation. And the way we think is that there is a vector of cognitive and non-cognitive skill of the child that evolves over time. So the child is born with some innate skills. That these skills get accumulated partly because the parent is going to put their own input just by spending time with their kids and by doing investment. Then there is also another part of the component that is this non-cognitive skill. And that has to do with the preferences, and these are important because they determine the choice that will be made by children. Okay, so this is the general flavor of the model, skipping many of the technical details. Let me now go back to parenting style and state clearly what we have in mind. So parents can intervene. Remember, parents and children have reasons to disagree here. So spontaneous behavior is in general not the type of behavior that parents approve of. Some parents may be more lenient, some parents may be less lenient and stricter, but there is potentially some scope for disagreement. So we're going to call a parent who spends time or money in order to restrict the child's choice set authoritarian. So sending, for instance, some parents send their children to boarding schools and they pay money for that. The children not always, it depends on the boarding school of course, but at least the one, my wife went to one of those boarding schools, she was not very happy to be there. And parents spend money. It was not a rich family, so they really thought that this was the right thing, and mostly because they thought that that would control what she could and she could not do. So a parent who restricts the choice set in a costly fashion is authoritarian. A parent who molds the child's preference parameters with the purpose of affecting the child's choice is authoritative. So there may be many ways in which parents can affect child well-being. One of them is, well, I take some type of action that modifies the original preferences of children in a way that they will be induced to make choices parents approve of. That's what we call authoritative. And otherwise, parents is called permissive. Now, we were yesterday at dinner with an interesting example. Someone said, the reason why I bring my child to, it was Jesse, where is Jesse? Yeah, the reason I take my child to do soccer is because I want to see the child have fun. Well, then Jesse is permissive. So he wants to engage, no, but again, permissive is nothing negative. Right? Many times we behave in a permissive way. But suppose he said, well, maybe he was not telling me the truth, but suppose he was saying, I do that because then I can write it in the CV. So, when he applies to Harvard or to Princeton, that's going to be good for the child. It's going to down to compare. Or, I do it because it helps children focus, being competitive, and fight hard for success. If you had given me that answer, I would say that Jesse is authoritative. So, that means that it's not everything is mutually exclusive here, but we have parents who would behave in a more authoritarian way. Well, that would be the parent who says you cannot go to play soccer, for instance, or you have to play soccer. Andrea Gassi was forced to play tennis, for instance. That would be an authoritarian approach. Authoritative would be in order to make the child more focus on task, and permissive would be in order to increase fun. That's how we think about the three parenting styles. Okay, this is very general. Let me give you first an application, still abstract but less so, and then I'm going to show you data. Okay, so let me think about a less general model that has the following feature. There is in the early childhood, parents may decide the parenting style. So they may decide to mold their children's preferences, restrict or expand their choice set. That's the key choice in early childhood. In the previous model, the parent would do also other things. Here it does only this. And suppose that in late childhood, children make an educational effort. Let's suppose again to be focused and concrete, that choice, that at that point preferences are given. So preferences are very malleable in early age, and they are not malleable at all in late age. In reality, neither is true. So even investing in the preference of small children doesn't always work, and it's true instead that somehow trying to condition teenagers sometimes work. But here it's early it works, later it doesn't. And so think about the following version of the general model I told you. There is an early childhood where the child accumulates a vector of cognitive skill that I call H2, and that depends on the skill of the parents, so the environment, on the innate skill of the child, and on characteristic of the neighborhood. So the peers, the quality of the neighborhood. So it's a kind of mechanical process of accumulation of cognitive skill. Suppose you cannot, nothing affects that. That's again, to make the example sharp. And then there is the part that is non-cognitive, and that part that is non-cognitive is affected by the choice X1, which is the choice of parenting style of the parent. So the parent can decide to be one of the three. And here it's just a discrete choice. It can be authoritarian, authoritative, or permissive.
So can I just ask a question? So does the motive matter, going back to Jesse's example, it could be permissive or authoritative?
In this example, it can only be one of them.
Okay. So the motive matters, like why you do something, not just the behavior per se, but why you do it. That's what I'm trying to understand. Does the X1, I could send my child to soccer in both cases, under both scenarios.
Yeah, that's true.
But in one case I would send it for one reason, in another case I would send it for another reason. So the point is, in this example, it's just discrete choice. You can do a bit of everything, but in that case, the choice would essentially have the same consequences. But you can think in a broader sense that if you choose to be authoritative, you not only have the soccer choice, you do a bunch of other things, and something distinguishes. Otherwise, there's nothing wrong with just that then it's an environment where things are not well distinguished. Okay? So here is what happens in late childhood. So this is how the preferences evolve between late childhood and adult age. Here, again, in this example, the non-cognitive preferences are now formed, they are there, but what is important is that they affect the investment, in this case,
investment in education and occupational choice. So there is a choice of the child that is going to be dependent on the preferences that the child has been endowed with, and possibly on the restrictions that have been put on its behavior when a child. So in this model, you see there is a very strong sequential aspect. When you're a small child, you form the person. Then when the child is grown up, the child is going to make the choices. Okay? So suppose that there is some type of choice of that there is some realization of talent that comes at an earlier age. It's not always easy to figure out from children what that child will be good at at a later stage. Well, suppose that some child has some talent for being a painter, some child has a talent for literature, some child has a talent for math. Well, we model it in a way that the permissive parents let children go by their own inclination, and that will somehow make children better able of figuring out what they're good at. So they're going to be good painters. They will, parents will have catered to that, and children will make the choice. But if parents have been very authoritative and they have emphasized soccer for the sake of being disciplined with yourself, being competitive, well, that has already changed the nature of the child. So the choice is going to be twisted in a different way. In fact, authoritative parenting somehow fosters hard work. And now think about this situation. There are like three types of occupation. There are career-oriented professions, so being a lawyer, perhaps in academics, an engineer, managers. The feature of this is that they are on average better paid, but they require more investment. Then there are some creative professions. So think about being an artist. Well, being an artist may require a lot of devotion, but it's also typically more fun to learn, to paint and to sing than to do first-year master, perhaps. So that's which is what I teach. So somehow, in an ex-ante sense, parents would have thought about this later trade-off and could have twisted the children either in the direction of, well, making their independent choice. So some children will choose the creative side. The problem is that parents may not like how much effort they put in what children do. So, that's the type of trade-off. When you have independent-minded children, you may have successful artists, but sometimes you may also have not non-successful artists, because in the end, that's not they have not put much effort. And the other is, twisting children in the direction of money, success, something that is in future, and make them work hard in preparing their MBA. That's the other choice. So there is a disagreement here intrinsically, where children have a natural tendency to go towards the number two, and parents may or may not twist them towards number one. Okay, there is also another possibility, which is, in a world where not much changes, skills are transmitted within the family. You don't have to go to school. And in that case, it's more important what parents can directly teach to children. So this is the type of trade-off that we emphasize a bit more formally in our work. So how is it resolved here? Well, think about a society where there is very low occupational mobility and possibly also low social mobility. A very traditional society where most people work in the farm and most skills are transmitted within the family. Leaving the farm may not be such a great idea, and children may at some point want to try that because of risk love or risk tolerance. And then you would have that parents try just to keep children in the traditional track. So one dimension is how much incumbency value there is in a society. So how much the society reproduces itself, and parents can directly teach what they know to their children. Now let's move to a society where that's not the way most of the process of skill accumulation takes place. Is that in this alternative society, parents have a lot of, so parents have to delegate to children the decision. Well, then children are going to make that choice. But what choice they are going to make
depends also on how much their preferences have been shaped. So in a society where the choice, there will be little inequality, and so the outcome does not very much depend on the effort and educational effort of the child, we're going to have more permissive parents. In a society in which inequality is large and the return to education is high, we're going to have many authoritative parents. Okay, so with this in mind, we can envisage a world where the decision of parenting is driven by two dimensions. The first is what we call the return to incumbency. So somehow how much skills can be transmitted within the family and by controlling directly the behavior of children. In very traditional society, parents are going to be authoritarian. The authoritarian parenting style has been the dominating mode of parenting for centuries. And we argue that that's related to the way in which the process of skill transmission is done inside the family. Now let's move to a society where the value of the incumbency is lower. Think of a society that is turning from agriculture to industrial, or a society where there is a high rate of technical progress. Well, things change. Parents cannot just transmit what they know to their children. Children have to go to school, for instance. Well, then, the authoritarian parenting style just ceases to work. There is no possibility of monitoring directly the children. Now it becomes also important what is the return to education. If we are in a society like the 1960s, where inequality was low, and in the end, engineer might do better on average than artists or blue-collar workers, but the difference is not very large. Well, then better let children do their own choices and not mingle with their and not interfere with their natural tendencies. But when the return to education starts increasing in the recent 3 decades, then parents are going to move in a more authoritative direction. And somehow, let me cut it short here, well, what we observe here is that parents start exerting a growing amount of pressure on children, for instance, in terms of time they spend with them. If we compare the number of hours, so these are time diaries, so across different countries, what we observe that parents were spending significantly fewer hours with their children in the 1970s than they do today. And that's very consistent. The UK is a bit here is a bit of an anomaly, but I don't know to what extent it's a data issue. If we take the US, for instance, in 2012, parents spent in the typical family where there are 2 parents, they spent 3.5 times more hours than they used to do in 1976. And we have all this set host of phenomena like helicopter parenting, tiger parents, etc., that have exploded. So what we argue is that this is the result of the growing inequality. So in fact, you can see that this tracks very much the path of inequality. Okay, at this point that sounds like a conjecture. Can we say something a bit more precise than that? Let me go to the data. So let me go to parenting style across countries and over time. So it's not easy somehow to measure parenting styles, of course. So we have done it, if you happen to read the book, we have looked at different data sets in different countries and we've tried to be as consistent as possible. Let me describe one particular data set, which is the World Value Survey. Some of you may be familiar with it. So the World Value Survey asks a set of questions, the same question, to people in different countries, and then it reports how people reply. They are about everything, about the democracy, about freedom, about any value aspect. Part of this, a particular section of this, it's about the important values in child rearing. So parents are offered a menu of choices and say, what do you think among these choices? Select 5 that you regard as most salient. It turns out we have done it in a variety of ways, but if you focus on these 4 values, you cover 90% of the parents across the world, which means there is a lot of signal there. We have also done more sophisticated statistical type of aggregation, but this is the more direct way. So imagination and independence are values that we attach to being permissive. Hard work is something that we attach to being authoritative. Obedience is something we attach to be authoritarian. Okay, so first, let me tell you something because I have hinted before. If you look across developed and developing countries, in developing countries with large agricultural sector, you have a vast predominance of authoritarian parenting style that declines with the decline of agriculture and with the increase of the share of people who take formal education. But let me focus now mostly on the dimension of inequality. So here is a measure of income inequality for a set of OECD countries, so broadly speaking, industrialized nations. And on the vertical, you have the fraction of parents who praise different value. And here, I'm singling out three of them, three of the four I showed you: imagination, independence, and hard work. So here, actually, I have added in this particular graph Russia and China. They are two big nations, although they are not formally OECD countries. So you see that imagination tends to be less and less popular in countries with a high income inequality. It doesn't matter how you measure it. So this I'm using Gini. Later I use different measures. So, and imagination is very popular in countries where inequality is low. The same is true for independence. When you look at hard work, is a mirror image. This is China. The United States is here. Oh, Canada is always in the middle. Everywhere is in the middle. Canada is in the middle. Canada is in the middle. Canada is in the middle. So, you're perfectly on the, this country is perfectly on the regression line. We have some issues with France and Spain. French and Spanish parents don't really like much to be permissive, and we discussed that in the book. You know, the organizational school system may be responsible for that. But you know, this is, I think, quite striking pattern, which I didn't expect to be so clear. And I'm going to show you that this pattern holds also when I go down to a more micro level. Let me also show you what happens if I classify parents without telling you how in detail I do. Well, same story. Permissive parent, the share of permissive parents is very high in low inequality countries. Authoritative parents is high in high inequality countries. Also the authoritarian, although the relationship is less strong. Well, if I look at tax progressivity and social expenditure, same story. So in countries where there is more redistribution, be it by progressive tax, be it by social expenditure, parents are more permissive, parents are less intensive. By intensive, I mean a mixture of authoritarian and authoritative. I could do it in a regression way. In fact, I think it's interesting because you could say, well, there could be some common factor that makes some countries averse to inequality, and at the same time, more liberal in parenting style. So there is always this, when you run these regressions across country, you're always worried that you are mixing up other common factors. So one way to partially take this into account is to use different waves of the world value survey. So we don't have only one of them, but we have many times Swedish parents are asked over time what they think, and so are Americans, and so are Canadians. So one thing we could do is to subtract the average. So we don't look at the average Swedish parents, but we look at the change in behavior of Swedish parents over time as a function of the change in inequality. We look at the change in behavior of American parents as a function of the change in inequality. So we essentially remove completely the cross-country variation, and we just compare countries where inequality raises fast with countries where inequality raises less fast, or possibly even decline. In one case it does. The coefficient here of a regression estimate, this is a logit, is the same. So it means that it's really also within countries, we have the same pattern as across countries. As countries become more unequal, parents become more authoritative and push harder children towards hard work. It's also interesting to see that for holding constant the level of inequality, tax progressivity and social expenditure have the same have the expected effect. It would require a bit of explanation here. Here, these are odds ratios. So values smaller than 1 means a negative effect, and values higher than 1 means a positive effect. So what I'm saying here is that in countries where inequality is high, tax progressivity is low, and social expenditure is low, these are the countries in which parents are more pushy, are more helicopter parents, if you want me to use that term, towards their children. The differences are pretty large. So if I take, since I know also a lot of individual information, I can take two parents who are equivalent in terms of education, in terms of religion, everything I know at least, and then I place that parent in two different environments. Let's say Sweden and the United States. Well, the same parent who with probability 75% to be permissive in Sweden, once is placed in an environment in terms of inequality like in the United States, would have a probability of being permissive of only between 20 and 30%. So there are very large quantitative differences. Okay. So this is across countries. Some people think this is too aggregated. There are many other things that can be changed. So we are trying in some current work to go a bit inside no, sorry, let me say one thing first. So we have, in the book, we also document that this type of behavior of parents is in fact associated to educational outcome. So it is generally true that authoritative parenting style has a positive effect on educational outcome, which confirms at some level the earlier result in the child development psychology, but it's reassuring to see. And this is the part of the presentation that I will skip because I want to focus on something else in the remaining time. So there are relatively large effects on educational outcome of actually pushing children toward achievement. It's true by looking at PISA study in different countries, by looking at data in the United States, by looking at data in the United Kingdom. So all the time, the authoritative parenting style is conducive to better outcome in educational terms. Okay, let me say something about neighborhoods. So Judith Harris wrote a book some time ago saying all this emphasis on nurture is misplaced. I'm not convinced by the general argument there, but she admits that there is something that matters, it's peers. And I think that parents may have a lot of influence on the choice of peers. For instance, by location. The choice of living in a certain neighborhood versus another is going to have a big effect on the type of peers children interact. So even if you hold the view that in the end it's much more peers than parents that matter, well, parents can indirectly affect that choice. So in this in this study, we are going to the neighborhood and to the school level, and we're trying to see if in a more microeconomic environment, the insight that we have at the cross-country level holds true. Okay? So it takes a village. That's the name I've given to this paper. So this paper, we use data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health. And it's a representative sample of adolescents in grades from 7 to 12 in the United States. This is a study run in 1994 and 1995. We have a lot of information here, more than we have in the World Value Survey. So we know a lot about the family characteristics. We know about neighborhood characteristics because we can map these to some characteristics of the neighborhood. We know about the community, and most important, we know, so every child is asked to name 5 children that are her or his friends. So we know which type of children they hang out with. Now, interestingly, this data set has information on parenting style that is a remarkable thing, similar to the one in the Woodward survey. So, is it true that even at a much more disaggregated level, inequality affects parenting style in the way I've shown you before? This is the first question I draw your attention. Of the following, which do you think is the most important thing for a boy or girl to learn? Here, they can only choose one, and they have only 5 options. Before they had many options, they could choose 5. Well, to be well behaved, to work hard, to think for himself or herself, to help others, to be popular. Now, here we associate be well behaved to authoritarian parenting style, work hard to authoritative. That's very much what we've done in the Woodward survey. It's a bit more uncertain, the permissive. Think for yourself is a form of independence, so I think we strongly associate with the permissive. The other two are a little more uncertain. But interesting, what you do with the other 2 categories. Be popular is chosen by 29 parents. Not surprising, it's not very, probably don't tell your child you ought to be popular. So I wouldn't. So help others, it's a little bit ambiguous. We think if anything is going to be a symptom of permissive, but it may not. And so whatever you do with those 2, it doesn't matter. It's these 3 that matters. These three answers that matter. Okay, so now let's classify parents like this, and let's look across school districts. What do we find? On the left, so these are permissive, authoritative, authoritarian, percentage of the 3 types of parenting style. This is a measure of how rich the neighborhood is. It's the median family income at school. So here it means richer places. In richer places, parents tend to be systematically more permissive. Actually, it's something we find also elsewhere. Now let's look at inequality. This is the family income 9 to 10 ratio. So it measures how much inequality there is at the school district level. Permissive is decreasing. So high inequality means parents turn less permissive. Parents turn more authoritative, and parents turn more authoritarian. That's essentially the same picture I showed you before. And even if I control for the other characteristics I have of the neighborhood, like how wealthy they are, this survives almost intact. So the picture that holds across country also holds across school districts in the United States. That's the first observation that we find interesting. Now let's come to the Unitarian hypothesis. So let's think about one particular form of intervention. Why this one? Well, because we have a particular question that helps us. We would love to have more of these type of questions. But there is one that we think it's telling. Do your parents let you make your own decision about the people you hang around with? No and yes. Well, 16% of the parents are, we call them intensive about friends. What we could say, this is a dimension, authoritarian dimension, perhaps it is. We want to be open to the possibility that some of these parents not literally forbid, because it may also be difficult, but really try to convince their children to not hang around with certain peer. So we call them intensive, and interpretation I leave it to you. It's certainly non-permissive. If you want, we call 84% of parents are permissive in this dimension, 16% are non-permissive. How does this change with the characteristics of the neighborhood? Again, same picture. If I go to a richer neighborhood, parents do not interfere. They let their children go with whomever they want. Inequality, in the more unequal places, that's where parents intervene and tell their children more frequently not to go out with those particular friends. Well, I mean, it's not too surprising, it's where somehow the risk is can be found, but it's again remarkably similar to what I showed you before. Okay, does it matter? We observe children here in 2 subsequent ways. There's a 1 year of difference, a bit more than 1 year of difference between the 2 times in which they are surveyed. So the first question I have is, does it affect really the, so first question, sorry, is in which peer environment are parents intensive or non-permissive about friends? Well, this actually showed, this is a bit like the regression version of the, of the previous graph. It just shows that if I look at, the interesting thing is, this is not just at the neighborhood level. I can actually look within schools, and I can look at the type of peers that children have in the same grade. Once again, same type of message. If I have more inequality, so this is the standard deviation of the GPA within grade, that increases the probability that parents are intensive about friends. This is no longer a logic for the more technically minded people. This is just an OLS regression. So positive means positive. So more inequality here means leads to parents being more being less permissive, let's say. Okay. So what we are working on now is to construct a structural model that has some of the characteristics that I discussed before. So there is a first stage where parents decide their parenting style, children make their friendship decision, the peer group is realized, parents make some investment, and then the child scale is realized. We haven't finished that, so I'm going to present you only some reduced form regression. So just some data description. But what we're planning to do is to estimate this in a more structural way. Okay, so first of all, is there an effect of parenting style on peers in a statistical sense? Well, here is what we find. So this is a regression where we look at the average grade of the friends of the child as a function of the child's own grade. So the children with higher grades, they typically have friends with higher grades. This is the grades of the children in the former edition. So if a child has children who were higher grade, got higher grade, they continue to have a higher grade. And then this is the intervention of parents over the children. Well, in general, it's on average positive, but there is a big difference between the entire set of families and single mothers. So if you look at intact family, then there is a strong effect, consistent with the conjecture that single mothers may have it harder to actually influence children because of the time constraint and other issues related to the family. So if we look at intact families, which are families where both parents are present, well, then we see that having intervention on children is going to affect actually the type of peers that children choose as they grow, even conditioning on their starting point. But perhaps more interesting, it's going to affect the grades. So when parents intervene, even conditioning on the grade the child was getting before and on the peer that was there, then children are going to get higher grade when parents intervene. So that's a kind of micro dimension of this type of treatment that we find interesting. And this effect is very strong in low-income neighborhoods. So it's especially so in low-income neighborhoods and in neighborhoods with high inequality too. I don't have the result here. That parental intervention in pushing children in selecting their friends has a positive effect on grades. You may feel a different way. I like a lot letting the children free to choose their friends, but certainly it suggests that in some environment intervention here leads to some results. So again, this is a kind of flash on one particular dimension of the parenting style that we think it's consistent with the overall picture. So there is an effect, and that effect is particularly important in community where there is more risk. And so the intervention of parents seems to be directed to the protecting children from the risk, but that also creates pressure on them and restriction on their freedom. The last topic I want to touch upon is something I want to discuss a bit more generally and less formally. We discuss in the book how there is this type of growing intervention of parents that we observe in all society, and more so in countries like the US, where inequality has grown faster, is leading to growingly, increasingly different environments in which children grow. And we believe that this is increasing actually the extent of the separation and the polarization of society. So we talk about parenting gaps and parenting traps. Here, what we observe is that it's especially highly educated families that have increased their investment in children, and that they have increased their involvement, sometimes even in a perverse way. We have experienced at Yale, Stanford, and other places, parents being willing to spend an enormous amount of money, even to cheat, in order to get their children through the selection process. So there are a number of reasons why this increasing race towards pushing children to success creates social barriers. Extracurricular activity may be expensive. The type of authoritative practice may require some soft skill that can be more available to highly educated parents. And then good schools and peer complement parents' effort to shape children's values. So it may be that it's much easier to push towards success in a type of environment where the peer environment is positive, as I was discussing before. So there is some type of multiplier effect that makes more unequal society to lead to more helicopter parenting, and more helicopter parenting feeding back in more division and more diversity about the type of parenting. Some symptoms here. Well, if we look at the growing involvement in parents with their children, in countries like the United States especially, much less so in Canada in fact, the growth in the number of hours spent by parents is much more concentrated among the highly educated parents. So if you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, highly and low educated parents were spending about the same number of hours, a bit more. The more educated parents were spending a little more time, but not a big deal. But then today there is there is a much wider gap in the time that parents spend with their children, in the sense that highly educated parents, they spend much more time than do less educated parents. If we look at also practices like spanking, which are associated with authoritarian parenting style, and not in many ways not associated with healthy outcome from the point of view of child behavior and child happiness. Well, in the 1960s, there was about the same attitude in terms of approval of spanking, and today there is a very different attitudes. That's the United States. In Europe, spanking is in most countries actually outlawed. So this goes together with society that is getting increasingly segregated in other dimensions. So we have more and more residential segregation, and the type of parenting that parents and children that children are subject to in different neighborhoods is increasingly diverse. There is a beautiful book by Robert Putnam that emphasizes those aspects. So the last point that I want to make is that this type of incentive that very unequal society generate can create over time different parenting, and eventually lead to what we call parenting traps, in which some part of society keep running this race, and part of society gets discouraged and gives up. So, and the final mention of the type of policies that may work in reducing this phenomenon. Well, I have already shown you that actually traditional forms of redistribution tend to be associated with different parenting styles. So, you know, resorting to more taxation and more redistribution and making the reward for high power investment less high can already go some way in reducing the gaps. Early child intervention may be important. Busing a larger proportion of children, as advocated by Chetty and Hendren, for instance, may work. And also the design of the educational system may be important. There are many obvious dimensions that could be where improvements are low-hanging fruit. I'm thinking about provision of subsidized daycare. You know, my daughter grew up in Sweden where daycare is provided essentially for free. I think it has an enormous effect in equalizing opportunities and also in incentivizing labor supply of mothers. There is a lot of evidence of that. The organization of the school system. For instance, in countries like Switzerland and Germany, the state spends a lot of money in providing for good vocational training. This is something that is almost absent in the United States. Differentiation of university systems. You know, there is a lot of discussion about how elite universities should organize their admission. One possibility is to go strictly by grades, which is what is done, for instance, in China. That has already ingrained a lot of potential inequality. Well, one of the approaches that is taken by some of the elite institutions is to increase the importance of other activities. But those other activities, I think, is where exactly the inequality aspect and inequality opportunity is most important. You know, taking children to a lot of extracurricular activity requires a lot of money and a lot of time. So somehow increasing both, you know, more open admission and also increasing the space for less wealthy people, and you know, making overall investment in the public education system in order to create less of a, you know, big advantage for going to certain institution, which is, you know, US more than a Canada topic, I guess. We think it's a very important aspect of the problem. And with this, I'm going to conclude by summarizing my point. I think that economics can help us explain broad trends in parenting, that recent rise in parenting gaps within societies may jeopardize equality of opportunity and lead to persistence of poverty. And there are a number of policy interventions that would certainly work in alleviating this and avoiding that the process of polarization of society would go forward through the mechanism of parental style.
Okay, thanks, Fabrizio. So I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. And,
do I need a mic? Yeah, thanks. They're super interesting. Actually, at one point in time, I was thinking you could write a book that was called like why rural parents spank their children before you even put that slide up, because this is something that's been on my mind lately. But I have a different question. In terms of international comparisons, and also I think differences between socioeconomic groups within countries, I think one of the big differences is the expectation that children will support the parents as the parents age. And that if you don't expect your children to support you, then your children go off and be artists and do whatever you like, because it's not going to affect your standard of living later on, because you have your ability to support yourself, or you know, you're in Sweden and you don't need to worry because the social structure will support you as you age. So I was wondering a little bit about that in terms of the policy recommendations at the end, about how the importance of either like publicly funded pension programs or properly functioning financial markets that make it possible for people to save, how that might be playing into differences in parenting styles.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a very good observation. And actually, we do discuss some of these issues in the book. I think the more salient dimension where this intervenes is the difference between traditional
societies where pension systems are still underdeveloped, and then, as you say, there is a strong expectation that children will take care of their parents. I think it's going to contribute to parents trying hard to keep their children around. So geographical mobility, moving from rural to urban areas. China is experiencing a big turmoil because of that. Because when children, this is a society where parents have grown under the expectation that children will take care of them, but especially in the rural area, once children have left, there is some flow of resources, but it's much less important. So somehow, I think in modern society with pension system, the salience of this aspect has declined, but in explaining why the authoritarian model was so resilient, and somehow the importance of authority of the elderly also was so important, has certainly played an important role. I guess that in more urbanized society, the expectation today is less is less salient. There is also an issue that concerns the number of children that people have. So when you have a well-developed pension system, you tend to see this gets associated, the causality being a bit uncertain, with people having fewer children. So again, in societies where the children are supposed to take care of the parents, we see higher fertility. Higher fertility in turn tend to be associated with, by necessity, with less investment in parenting effort per child, and so somehow this ties together. Yes, please.
Hi. Yeah? Okay. I was wondering how immigration from developing countries to developed countries, so countries which have higher rates of immigration, affect parenting styles.
Yeah, I guess the evidence is that parents bring with them. I mean, this is our whole approach says, well, it's not only culture, but I'm not here trying to say it's not culture at all. So we observe that parents bring with them certain values. So people moving from China, people moving from Italy to the United States, they tend to behave partly according to the incentive of the new country and partly according to their cultural heritage. We also tend to see that this type of behavior tends to decline with second generation. So one aspect is it introduces certainly some of this persistence and origin of immigrants certainly matter. It's also the case that in general immigrants are selected in a way. Now that's there is a lot of variation, but I would say the average pattern is immigrants are selected in a way that they bring with them more human capital than financial wealth, and so if anything, they tend to be more ambitious in the school process. So we observe all these communities that work really hard for their children to climb up the social ladder, because there may be families that look in their own country, they had a reasonably high level of human capital. Now in the new countries they are not that rich, so that becomes the only, the most important way to do social ascent. And this is the way I see this. Yeah. One episode. So in Switzerland, there is an exam so children are tracked in 6th grade. In some parts of Switzerland, not all, which is a bit crazy in my view, but that's the way it's done. So children can go to the upper or to the more academic or less academic track. Now that system was based on the presumption that parents would not do much, children would just go to the exam and then they would just detect if children are more academically gifted or less academically gifted, except that the influx of immigrants has created people maybe like myself when I was there, who spend a lot of effort then in training the children. And so there's a lot of complaint in the Swiss societies about immigrants having screwed up that system because, we work very hard, perhaps too hard. But, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I was thinking, so the way you've depicted this is sort of sounds like a little bit of a zero-sum game, but is there something good that can come out of this? I mean, in the sense that, should I think that Sweden is losing out on like aggregate GDP growth because, if at the aggregate level, so, I certainly don't like to have to invest all this time, but is there anything good coming out of it?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and certainly something that requires more work to get, to the optimal point in the trade-off. So I don't think societies where there is, no incentive to work hard and to make success is what we want as economists. We tend to think that some inequality is good because it provides incentives. At the same time, it's not that we see that Swedes are lazy and they do nothing. It's perhaps the truth is that if I also look at, I've lived 7 years in Scandinavia. I know many people there. The school system creates also a system of value that favors cooperation and teamwork. And teamwork is also very important for innovation. So and another thing that I think is true is that rote learning is not the right way to innovation. So if we think that in the end what matters for society is just working hard, then we give one answer. But maybe that displaces other type of talents, and it may not be so important to do well all the exams. It may be more important to think independently on the side and having a view about what. And that can create also more innovation. So some of these societies, like Sweden and Finland, although they are small countries, they are also very, very innovative. I don't want to say, nothing, everything is good in Sweden and Finland, everything is bad in the US. The US is also very successful in other respects, but my concern is that this zero-sum game, or maybe it's called the arms race, this arms race effect has gone way too far. And in the end, although people may learn by doing music and do other things, it has become much more of investment in signaling. So there are always these two components. You invest in something, it gives you maybe more human capital, but then there is the signaling component. And I'm concerned that the second part has gone way too far.
So basically, thanks very much everybody for attending. I should also mention one more thing, that the co-organizer is Munir Squire, who just had a baby girl, and that's why he's not here, and he really put a lot of work into this. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.